A very good afternoon as everyone is coming in. Very, very glad to have you here today. Please do. I'm going to just kind of make small talk for a couple of minutes while everybody drops in. So please, as you arrive, do feel free to let me know who you are in the chat. I've got the chat open and I would love to be able to speak to you. And that kind of applies throughout the whole of the session today. I would really, really like your engagement. I would like to know who you are. So I'm very excited to be here. Very, very happy to be here with you. We are 19 so far, which is fantastic. Of course, if you don't want to chat, that's also fine. If I am on in the background, if you are interested in just what we have to say, that is absolutely okay as well. I'm not going to, don't want anybody to be uncomfortable this afternoon. But if you do want to say anything, hello, Clarice, it's nice to have you here. I am very happy. Where are you coming in from today? I'm always intrigued to know where people tune in from, because of course, when this was a London-based show, it was mostly British people. So I love the fact that we can now reach out to an international audience. I think that's very cool. Oh, in London. Perfect. Elena, hello, joining in from Birmingham. Hello, Carrie. You are in Geneva, third year German, French translation and interpretation student. Amazing. Tim, hello, you studied translating children's literature as part of your MA with Roehampton. Oh, very cool. Very cool. David in Cambridgeshire. Carolyn in Devon, learning French. Fantastic. BA translation third year. Lovely. Maria is in London, teaching English as a foreign language. Fantastic. Love to teach more literature. I know. I'm a teacher, and I always think the lack of literature on foreign language syllabi is a real shame. Hello from Tuscany. Claire is in Tuscany. I'm quite jealous right now. I'm not going to lie. I'm sitting here in Gloucestershire, where it's actually the weather's not too bad, but I am quite jealous. Roz, hello, mature student at the University of Surrey doing an MA in translation. Ah, snap. But not Surrey. Having taught French for 20 years, fantastic. I hope the career change works well for you. I'm 16 years in teaching, so I'm kind of hoping to see whether I can run the two alongside each other for a little while, but we know what teaching is like. I don't know how practical that's going to be. Henry's from Seaford in East Sussex. Gloomy, that is the word that I was after. Thank you. I'm going to be honest, I don't mind the gloomy weather myself. I think gloomy is fine, but as long as my lighting holds out for the video, I think we'll be all right. Okay, we are quite a few people in now. Okay, Clarice is contemplating specializing in literary translation. In doing the research for today, I found so many articles that were along the lines of why we should be translating literary texts and the fact that there is so little of it. And a lot of the examples, a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today are actually from pop culture texts, because it tends to be the pulp stuff that gets translated. I suppose the stuff that publishers think will sell. And literary fiction kind of gets left behind. And I understand why, because literary fiction does have its own style, its own genre, and quite often, because of the types of language used, it can be really difficult to translate. I mean, if we take French, for example, I love French as a language. French is beautiful, but even just run-of-the-mill French is flowery as it is. And you then have literary French, which gets even more so. And it can be quite difficult, I think, to get that across in English properly in a way that people will want to read. Absolutely. Claire says it's not the easiest form of translation, no. But, let's be honest, we're all linguists here. We like a challenge. It's why we go into languages, because we like a challenge. Okay, I am It really is. Elena says that there's a lot of focus on other specialisms, but literature is the best. It is. It is. I've watched some of the other translation um, seminars today, and it has been interesting. I hear people talk about going into medical translation or legal translation, and I'm going to be very honest. That frightens me. The idea of, and I know that you're not putting any opinions in there. You don't need to have the legal knowledge. The point is to have the language knowledge. But the idea of translating something that could be life and death for some people is quite frightening to me. I would much rather translate things that will entertain people and should uplift people. So we've got a nice selection of people. I love it. Please do keep talking in the chat. I am going to keep the chat open. I am Anybody who has seen me around the internet will know that I can talk for England. My talk at Language Show last year, I talked about Lu Xun, the Chinese writer, and his writing. And I actually had to host a second session to finish that off. So I am going to keep chat open, and I will kind of respond to things that stand out to me. I'm going to keep the Q&A open as well. So if you've got a question that you would like me to see and attempt to answer, or to put out into the chat for others to try and answer, please drop it into the Q&A. Please use the chat just to talk to each other, talk to me. If you've read any good translations lately, enable me to spend some more money. I've literally just, as I was setting up, I had an Amazon parcel delivered, and I am very willing to have another one come tomorrow. So if you've read anything good, please do drop it in. Kirsten says, hello from Hertfordshire, doing an MA in translation. Lovely. Final year translation and commentary of, the letters between Albert Camus and Maria César. Nice, nice, nice. Freelance translator of psychiatric and mental health. Wow. So that is a bit of a jump from the health side through to the literature. Excellent, excellent. I am so glad to have you here. Okay. A little bit about me before we get started, because I know quite often, you come to these things and you've got somebody sitting in front of you who is selling themselves as an authority on what they're talking about, but you have no idea who they are. So I'm Darren. It's nice to meet you all. I am a teacher of modern and classical languages. I'm in my 16th year of teaching. I speak 9 languages, including English as my mother tongue. So I speak English, French, German, Dutch, Mandarin, Japanese, Biblical Hebrew, and Ancient Hebrew and Biblical Greek. I have a master's degree in applied linguistics, and I'm currently studying for my master's in translation. I'm actually specializing in Latin and French translation, but my plan ultimately is to have my Mandarin certified by the Chartered Institute of Linguists so that I can offer that one as well. I am a writer. I've had work published. I've had fiction and non-fiction published, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my fiction today, because I actually acted as translator for my own fiction, which saved me quite a lot of money, I'm going to be very honest. And I also present on the Teacher Talk Radio Saturday morning breakfast show. So that is, it is aimed at teachers. And I do talk a lot about teaching, but I do recognize the names in the chat. And so anybody who's heard my Saturday morning will tell you, it does mostly end up talking about either literature or language, because those are my big things. So please do feel free to join me on a Saturday morning. You just Google Teacher Talk Radio and you can find me. I am also on Twitter. I am at Mr. D Lester, all one word. I am perpetually on Twitter. I think lots of us are currently thinking about where we go afterwards, but I still like Twitter, so I'm sticking with it for a little while. So please do, if you want to, again, no pressure. I'm not one of those people who is striving for millions of followers, but if you do want to give me a follow, if you do want to keep this conversation going when we are done, please do follow me and we can keep talking over on social media. Oh, Elena said that currently reading a new translation of Beowulf. It's an interesting interpretation. I love that word, interesting. I love that it's always one that we use figuratively rather than literally. We'll pop that in there. So I want to talk about first about why we translate. Let's be honest, okay? Because again, we are all linguists here. Or, we all have interest in languages. We all have other languages. It's why you're at the language show. There is a lot of cachet in being able to say, oh, yes, I read it in the original French. Yes, I read it in the original Japanese. And let's be honest, we quite like that. Or maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm a bit more egotistical than I like to think I am. Clarisse, I'm actually not on LinkedIn, but I probably should be. So what I will try and do is, obviously I can't do it during my talk, but I will create a LinkedIn account, and then at some point over the weekend, I will try and get back in touch with you. Or maybe if you're on LinkedIn, I can search you, and then we can connect there. So yeah, there is a lot of cachet associated with being able to speak and read the language. And I'm not gonna lie, there are times where that is important. Okay, I think it is important for us all to be able to understand the original forms of texts. So, for example, as a religious person, I don't want my deeply ingrained beliefs to be interpreted through the lens of somebody else, the lens of a translator. I want to come up with my own. So that's why I think that reading in the initial language is very important. However, I have come to believe a lot more that reading in the foreign language, in the foreign language, in English for the case of most of us, but not always, as we will look at, is also very important for all sorts of reasons. And interesting that we've already mentioned Camus, because this new translation of La Peste and its translation by Laura Maris is really interesting to me. Very famous line in The Plague. The Plague came out in 1947 originally, and is about plague on its surface. It says that there's a very famous line that says, "À partir de ce moment, il est possible de dire que la peste fut notre affaire à tous." And Laura Maris translates that as, "From that moment on, it's fair to say that the plague affected us all." And is that not something that we've just lived through? And I read The Plague when I was at university the first time. And I read it, and I remember reading that line and going, yeah, okay, yeah, plagues affect people. Yeah, that's okay. I get that. Reading it again in Laura's translation, it really hit me, having been through COVID. And so it occurred to me that publishing a translated book is republishing that book. Camus can never rewrite La Peste. It's out. It does what it does. But through translating it, and through translating it in a lens of COVID, having been through COVID, Laura as the translator and I as the reader suddenly see a lot of what Camus was saying in a different way. It may not have been what he was intending. We don't know. But it is how we can interpret it now. And so it is like reading the book afresh. And quite often, publishing a new translation is a better way of doing that, in my opinion, than republishing the original. Because if we were to republish Camus' same words, à partir de ce moment, I would read that in French and go, yeah, because that's how I read it. That's how I know I understand that line. But seeing it again in a different form of English, it really, really brought it home to me. Kirsten's asked a question. When you say you translate your own texts, or like Nancy Houston, who does two versions, one in English, that's a good question. I do actually, I translate mine. It is a translation. There have been a couple of times where I have reworked my own translations because I felt that either something didn't work in Dutch, which was the language that I was translating into linguistically, or I just changed my mind about where I wanted a character arc to go. So in that case, there are kind of two editions. An English edition and a Dutch edition that are slightly different stories. But I do try, I think because I wrote it, and so I'm not seeing it through a different lens, I do try and keep it as faithful to the story as possible, because I know that that's how I wanted the story to go. Yeah, that's exactly what Clarissa said in the Q&A as well. I often fear one may end up writing another story altogether. And I think that can happen. But you could use that as a springboard, of course, into a different piece of work of your own. The other thing that we probably should talk about very briefly is localization. So translation is when you just take the text and you go words into new words. Localization is where you take the story and you make it as normal to the country of the language that you're translating into as possible. As an example, if we have, let's take La Peste, let's take Camus in French. Let's say we were trying to translate it into British English, and we took the word trottoir and we translated that as pavement. I, as a native British English speaker, would read pavement and go, yeah, okay, fine. An American English speaker would read pavement, and it kind of adds this layer of foreignness, because the American English speaker will go, well, pavement's a British word. Why is this French person using British words? So we have, if we don't localize, we have a level of invasion that can take you out of the story, because we assume that our own idiolects, I don't need to say own idiolects, that's what idiolect means. We assume that our idiolects are the default. They are neutral to us. So often it's not enough just to translate a piece. We also have to localize it in order to make sure the readers actually can absorb the true culture of the country they're reading about and not have our own. Absolutely. So David has just said, not only this, but pavement does mean something in US English. So yeah, when we are choosing our words, we can't assume that UK English and British English are the same. We can't assume that words mean the same thing. And so localization is very, very necessary. Yes, localization is a form of domestication. It takes it and puts it into a form that domestic people domestic to the place that you are, would understand. It means the roadway and the two side. Oh, okay. Okay, so a very, very different interpretation. So David has clarified, it means the roadway and two sidewalks in US English are a single piece of pavement. And if you have somebody walking down the pavement, that's quite a different interpretation. That could lead to a very different scene in your story. Sometimes localization can go very, very wrong. This, of course, is not from literature. This is from an anime. This is from the Pokemon anime. Japanese originally, localized because it's for kids, and localization happens a lot with children's literature because we want children to understand it. We want children to be able to access it. And sometimes it can go very wrong. In the picture that we have here, Brock, the character, is very clearly holding rice balls. I think I do speak Japanese, so I understand that I have cultural knowledge that maybe an 8-year-old doesn't. But to me, what he is holding there is very clearly rice balls. The translator and the localizer decided to call them donuts as a way of making that accessible. I don't necessarily disagree with changing the food, particularly when you're dealing with children's literature. There was somebody, and I forget who, I will tweet out the link, but there was somebody who said that food is to children's literature what sex is to adult literature. It's how in children's literature you use food to get across this idea of sensuality and of gluttony and of excess. So I'm actually not opposed to changing certain foods to make it accessible for children if you're dealing in children's literature. However, in this case, what Brock is holding, whatever it is very clearly not donuts. Wrong word. So sometimes localization can go quite wrong, and you do have to be very careful with it. You've got to make sure that you keep your contextual clues so that everything remains sensible. Otherwise, it throws you out of the world. And this now, you know, this aired in the late 90s, early 2000s. It's a meme at this point. Brock's Jelly-filled donuts are a meme. It's all over the internet. However, sometimes it can lead to something good. So Brock's Jelly-filled donuts that look like rice balls became such a meme that somebody on YouTube created them. So they made these donuts, they filled them with jam, and they put Rice Krispies, popped rice around the outside to try and mimic what he was doing. So sometimes you can have fun with it as the translator, as the localizer. You know, and if you were working on a multimedia text, if you were working on a text that had an accompanying podcast and YouTube channel, then you could do something fun with this in order to help get the marketing people on board. But of course, it doesn't always work that way. Yes, I have. I am going to be honest. I mix my UK and American English quite often. So yes, it's interesting, isn't it, how people won't settle, how people won't settle on one or the other, which can be very, very confusing. From my experience of localization, it can actually change how you interpret the story. So this is Konbini Ningen, a convenience store woman, it's called. Very accurate translation of the title for those of you who don't speak Japanese. Konbini, this word here. Oh, I don't actually know if you can see my mouse. The first 4 characters in the title up there in yellow, that says konbini. It means convenience store. Ningen, the second 2 words there, they can feasibly mean woman, it's person. I read this in Japanese when it came out in 2016, and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it very much. It was a story about a middle-aged woman. She worked in a convenience store. Society was telling her, oh, you shouldn't have a job anymore, you know, and if you do, it shouldn't be in a convenience store. You should be married by now. You should have children. But she really liked her job. She liked working in the convenience store and she wanted to stay there. She was very quirky, and I expect that from Japanese literature. Japanese literature is full of quirky characters. And I ended the book, I finished reading it, and I was like, yeah, that was enjoyable. That was good. I like the main character. I then read it in English, and the English translation is actually very faithful, in my opinion. But what I realized in English is that the main character isn't actually quirky. She is supposed to be outside of the norm in quite an extreme way. There's a section at the end of the book, so spoilers. If you don't want to be spoiled for Convenience Store Woman, just kind of mute me now, and when the slide changes, you can come back. At the end of the story, she has to find a new job in a new convenience store. And she goes to the new store and she says about how she feels like she is part of the store. She is as much a part of the store as the shelves are, and the flickering overhead lights and the tiled flooring. And she says that she doesn't feel like she's a person anymore. She feels like she's a commodity. She's an extension of the store. When I read that in Japanese, I was just like, oh, quirky, nice, because that's the kind of thing that I expect from Japanese literature. When I read it in English, it hit a little bit differently. Not because of the difference between languages, you know, I read Japanese perfectly fine. And isn't it interesting that I feel the need to explain that to you? That I feel the need to say, oh yeah, I read it in the original Japanese before I tell you that I read the translation. Because we don't see these characters who have such a different mentality, and it's not even a Japanese versus British mentality, it's a mentality that you don't expect of a human being, it was more shocking to me. So localization, actually, by removing that foreignness and by removing the tropes that you kind of expect from literature in different cultures, it helps you to realize what the author was actually getting at. And we will all find this. Those of you who are looking to go into translation, you will specialize in one or two languages. And so you will get accustomed to, if you're not already, the tropes of those languages that you're translating into and out of. And if we're not careful, we can become so accustomed to those tropes that we do miss what the author is actually trying to say. So keeping an eye on English translations and reading in translation into your first language can help you to not acclimate yourself so much. In reading translated literature, we are opening the window to a whole new world of stories and experiences that may not have been available to us. It is well known that depending on the language you speak, your experience of the world may be completely different. If not directly translatable, we can at least get a glimpse of these different experiences and ways of thinking that we would normally not be exposed to in our own language. So we need to think quite carefully about the language that we are being exposed to when we read translated literature, particularly from languages that have words, ideas, concepts that don't exist in English. Because it can be very difficult to get those across, but it's very important so that we can understand these other people. So I did some Googling and I found one of those lovely lists of words that have no English equivalent. Kummerspeck is there up at the top. Kummerspeck, I think, is my favorite, and it's one of my favorite German words altogether. Literally, it means grief bacon, which I just love the idea of personally. I apologize to I know that I have a few vegetarians in the audience, so I do apologize for the generalization that Kummerspeck has. Kummerspeck grief bacon refers to the idea of eating your feelings, overeating when you're upset, overeating when you're depressed. So you turn to the grief bacon in order to quell how you're feeling. And, you know, there is no succinct, nice, easy way to get that across in English. We don't need it in English, perhaps the same way that it is needed in German. And English doesn't work in that same way. Grief bacon as a compound word would not work. Overeating food as a compound word would not work, but it works quite nicely in German. And so if you are not a speaker of German, or if you maybe speak German but don't have much exposure to German people, that might not be a thing that you've come across before. It's something we can all relate to, or again, maybe I'm just outing myself as somebody who eats his feelings. But it's certainly something, comfort eating. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, not quite as succinct. Comfort food, yes. But then again, what's interesting here is that we're going for that translation of comfort, whereas the German specifically talks about grief. And you kind of need to get into the headspace of what is the important thing here? Is it Kummerspeck as a concept, in which case we can look at comfort food? Or are we honing in on the grief part? Is that the important part? Because that then is going to affect our translation. The next few languages I don't speak, so I apologize for any mangled pronunciation I'm about to do. Gigil in Tagalog is a situation that is overwhelming in its cuteness. So it's kind of related to the Japanese kawaii, the concept of cuteness. And again, this is something that exists. In fact, it exists right now in my family chat. My sister has been texting pictures of her new puppy. And my mum posted yesterday, "That's so cute, how do you stand it?" And I was like, that's literally Gigil. That's this, something that is overwhelming in how cute it is. And I feel like you could use that as a nice, simple slot it in if you were writing in Tagalog. Whereas in English, we're going to need something a bit more fluffy to get that across. It's like when people translate kawaii from Japanese into English as cute. And it's like, yes, but kawaii is actually the concept of cuteness. Uber cute. I like that. I like that. And again, that was Roz's suggestion. And so we're using intensifiers now. We're using modifiers. We're using a modifier from German. So we are keeping our cross-linguistic interests going. Menkolek from Indonesian is that thing where you tap somebody on the shoulder to get them to look the wrong way. So they're looking, you tap them here, but you're standing over this side behind them. Okay, something that exists in most cultures, but we don't have a word for in English, certainly not in British English. Panapo'o in Hawaiian, the idea that you scratch your head to help you remember something. Okay. So, and it's very similar to turning down the radio when you're trying to concentrate. But again, we don't have a word for that in English. Shogunai is a Japanese word, something that can't be helped. It's that, well, what you gonna do? It's shogunai. And even trying to translate that into English, I couldn't come up with anything succinct enough to get that across. I had to put the, well, what you gonna do in there. And then I had to be happy that I was speaking to you, because I realized that that could be misinterpreted just in text as, well, what are you going to do? And that inflection there is very, very important. And if we're translating literature, that's something that we don't have. That's something that we don't get across. Shnemezel in Hebrew is a very unlucky person. I like the fact that German has a word for a punchable face. I feel like English needs that word. And then in Thai, we've got this idea of needing to ask for help, but not wanting to be an inconvenience. And again, I think if you were translating a book from Thai that had somebody at her lowest moment, she was feeling this way, and it was wrapped up in Thai in this succinct krungjai. And then in English, you had to write, and she needed to ask for help, but didn't want to be an inconvenience, try and get that across. It's going to be a bit wordy. It's going to kill the mood. Yes, in Petaklak, the punching ball. Yeah, I like that one. That came in from Joanna. So I think quite often what you have to do, particularly when we're taking these concepts that don't exist in English, is not necessarily be faithful to what is said, but be faithful to the mood that it's in. And that's something that that translations unfortunately also get grief for. People will say, oh, well, it wasn't an accurate translation because they chose this instead of this. And you sort of have to go, yes, and I can justify that because of the mood that I was going for. Octavio Paz said, the signs of a tongue we don't know may cause us to react with astonishment, annoyance, indignation, or amused perplexity, but these sensations are soon replaced by uncertainties about our own language. We become aware that language is not universal, that there is a plurality of languages, each one alien and unintelligible to the others. Although language is not universal, languages form part of a universal society in which, once some difficulties have been overcome, all people can communicate with and understand each other. And they can do so because in any language, people always say the same things. Universality of the spirit was the response to the confusion of Babel. Many languages, one substance. So if you are translating or if you are reading a translation, don't get hung up on Google Translate style, this word means this, and so that's what I'm going to say. Because that's not how our brains work. The way that we see the world is formed by the language that we have. We don't need the word Kummerspeck in English. We could have borrowed it in the same way that we borrowed Schadenfreude, but we haven't. Why? Because we don't need it. We have comfort food, which gets that concept across in a way that is perhaps more English in what it needs. The idea that we eat for all kinds of comfort instead of that focus on grief. The fact that we use food rather than bacon. So don't get caught up too much in whether it is a literal translation, because quite often that's not the best way to do it. That's not the best thing for us to do as writers. It's not the best thing for us to do as readers. Translators routinely find their command of English stretched to its limits, said Nikki Harman in 2017, in the process of finding a style that recreates that of the original. And of course, that's not limited to English. In trying to recreate, particularly authors who are linguists themselves, who like to play with words, you can end up doing something quite fun with language. I'm going to look at Harry Potter to exemplify this, because Harry Potter has got so many translations, and it's actually quite a useful book, a useful series to study if you are looking to go into translation to see how it's done. So I've taken the carving from around the mirror of Erised. In English, the carving around this mirror says, Erised stra eru oit ub kafu oit on warsi, which is nonsense. The point of it, and I don't think it's possible to do spoilers for the first Harry Potter book at this point. I think it's too ingrained in the cultural zeitgeist. The point is that you read it backwards. So it says, I show not your face, but your heart's desire. What the mainland Chinese translator, first mainland Chinese translator, tried to do when translating this was the same thing. So what they actually did was they took the English there at the top and they just transposed each syllable into a Chinese character. That Chinese doesn't say anything. It doesn't make sense. It's nonsense. And I read that and I thought, okay, that's quite lazy. I can see what you're doing. But then there was an asterisk by it, and there was an author's note at the bottom. And the author's note said, this is a secret Taoist chant. And I thought, oh, that's clever. That's very clever. Because what that translator chose to do was not worry about the language, not worry about the actual Chinese, but he took Taoism, this religious concept that exists in China, that feeds a lot of the superstition that many people still lead their lives by. I teach A-level Chinese to Chinese students. And so many of my students say, oh yeah, my parents consulted the fortune teller before they named me. So a lot of these Taoist principles do still exist in mainland Chinese culture. And the mainland Chinese translator just made that part of the world. So here, the Chinese version of Harry Potter has a layer added to it beyond what there is in the English version, because the mainland Chinese audience are being told that this ancient religion in the Harry Potter world is real. And these chants that they hear about, that they see on TV and they read about in books, they're real too in this world. And it kind of helps to ground them in. Whereas the Japanese translator did the same thing. So what the Japanese translator did was take the concept, I don't show your face, but I show what you desire, and wrote it backwards in Japanese. Okay, so it's exactly the same thing. But interestingly, most interestingly, is what from our perspective looks like the second word, mizono. Mizono. So that is desire backwards, but it means ditch. So what the Japanese translator has done is has taken this code, this game that children can play, because this is an alphabet that very young children learn to read. And interestingly, this wouldn't have worked if they had tried to write it in kanji, the Chinese characters that we use in Japanese, because each kanji means something specific, whereas this is alphabet it spells. So you've still got that fun game to play, figuring out what it means. And we've also then got this hidden meaning, this idea of being stuck in a ditch. Because for those of you who don't know Harry Potter, one of the dangers of this mirror is that it shows you what you want. It shows you your dream come true, and people kind of get stuck there, watching, staring at themselves. And so once again, the Japanese translator has added this meaning, mirror of the ditch, that gives a clue to the nature of the mirror that doesn't exist in its English name, Mirror of Erised, because Erised doesn't mean anything in English. So it's an interesting way of playing with the culture that you are translating into. And this is a big conversation that has to be had between the translator, the publisher, and the author. And some authors are more picky than others. Some authors will say, yes, you know the language, as long as you stay true to what I've said, go for it. Other authors want to have more control over the book. And those of you who are interested in going into translation, that will be conversations that you have, that will be emails that you have back and forth with the publisher, with the authors. Translation can also help you to challenge ingrained worldviews. Lots of Romance languages have two different words for they. There is a they if the group is exclusively female, and there is a they for if the group is mixed or exclusively male. And the male is the dominant, the male is the default, because it's also the mixed. Feminist translators, such as Louise von Flattel, are using their translation to challenge that worldview, challenge the idea that masculine is the default. And so where she translates a male Latin American writer who is not necessarily using pronouns, who is not making it clear whether he's talking about a male or female character, she's choosing to use the female. So as translators, you can challenge worldviews that you think are incorrect in the way that you choose to translate, in the type of language that you choose to use. Of course, that's a conversation that needs to be had with the publisher, with the writer. I remember a seminar that I attended recently with a translator of English into Dutch. Had a moment where he was translating a scene with a doctor in, and it was not clear from the English whether the doctor was a man or a woman. And so he chose to go for a woman, just because it's very rare to see female doctors in literature. And he ran that by the author, and the author said, oh, well, actually, I envisioned the doctor as a man, but it doesn't matter. And so the doctor is a woman in the translated version. There are, of course, difficulties with that in terms of, if it's a series and the author brings that character back later on, and it's important that they are one gender, and it's not the gender that you chose, that can cause a problem. But if it's a simple case of challenging a worldview and the author's okay and the publisher is okay, and you as the translator think that that's important, that is something that can be done. The penultimate thing I want to talk about, I may go a little bit over and I apologize for that, is the idea of exploring and creating new genres. I love magical realism. I do not speak Spanish, but I love magical realism. For me, it's kind of the adult migration of urban fantasy that I liked reading when I was a teenager. But magical realism doesn't really exist in English. It's not a genre that English has latched onto, but it is so popular in Spanish literature. Spanish language writers seem to love it. And so there was a time, as again, Nikki Harman in 2017 said, when magical realism hardly existed in literature at all. Then came along 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which is one of the world's most famous novels. And that translation was very helpful in making magical realism influential in the English-speaking sphere. So different languages, and again, you can think about the languages that you have, but different languages, different countries will place different imports on different genres. So Nordic languages, you get a lot of crime fiction in Nordic languages. We get a lot of crime fiction in English too. But if, let's say that there is not a lot of crime fiction that exists in Tagalog, there may be translations of Nordic literature into Tagalog might inspire Tagalog writers to start writing crime fiction. Finally, there is just finding joy. Garcia Marquez, Elena has left a message in the chat. Garcia Marquez said that Rabas's English translation of 100 Years of Solitude was better than the original Spanish. Because I think as the translator, you see it again through a different lens, you see it through a different worldview, you are removed from it. As the writer, you get so in your head about the story you want to tell. And sometimes what you put on the page is what's in your head, but it's not clear to the audience, to your reader. And you only know that because it was what was in your head. And the translator can come along and can make that clear for the audience. And this is why Elena's point is why I wanted to end with this quote from T.S. Eliot, who read Dante's Inferno with an English translation. So he read it as a parallel text. He didn't learn anything in particular from it, but he did learn to recite these large parts of these cantos. And in that way, he was able to compare how it sounded in Italian versus how it sounded in English. And for those of you that speak foreign languages, if you look at bilingual translations, you will be able to compare the English with the original Spanish, let's say, in keeping with 100 Years of Solitude, and make an informed choice about whether you think it's better. Because sometimes as the translator, you can make these improvements. 45 minutes isn't enough time. I'm going to have to ask for much longer next year. Before I go, though, Laura asked a very interesting question. What is the place of political correctness in translation? For example, having to rewrite or translate old books. This was a debate that I had in a seminar that I attended recently, because one translator was very, very much into, I'm going to make sure that this is politically correct. And so he removed from the translation anything that was racist, homophobic, or ableist. And you know, I thought his justification was, I can get these ideas, I can make it obvious that this character is a despicable human being without using this language that will offend, that will upset. And I thought, okay, yeah, I'm on board with that. But interestingly, that same translator didn't object to the use of the word lame as a proposed translation with something we were working on in the seminar. And it was actually me that pointed out that lame is an ableist term. And it was only at that point he went, oh yeah, that's true, we shouldn't use it. So at the moment, we are politically correct as much as possible in translation. If being non-PC is important for the character, if it's important for your character to use a slur, then that slur can be translated, but it must have a purpose. If it's the omniscient narrator and it's just in there because the author was racist, then no. Deleting history and the way society was seen at a specific time, yes, but the act of translation is the act of republishing. It's the act of destroying the work and remaking it. It's transformative. And so I suppose it's going to boil down to, and I quite like that this is the way that I'm ending my talk, it's going to boil down to what you think translation is for. Do you want to take this text and make it accessible to speakers of a different language as it was back then? Keeping in mind that if you take a text from a couple of hundred years ago that has racist connotations, let's say, and a modern reader reads it, they might object to that too in their native language. Or do you want them to access the story? Is it the book that is important, or is it the story that is being told? And that ultimately comes down to the assignment that you are given by the publisher or the agent. Do both, old and new, and debate. Look, I like that. I like that as a compromise. I do. Because I agree. that, you know, this is how things were. And if we forget that, we're not going to move on, we're not going to learn from it. But at the same time, we don't necessarily want to condone it. And you know, there are discussions, there are absolutely discussions that should be had. Oh, je vous en prie, bien sûr, bien sûr. Everybody, thank you ever so much for joining me this afternoon. I could stay here and talk for another 45 minutes quite easily. I hope that this session was everything that you wanted it to be. Please do connect with me again on Twitter at Mr. D. Lester, and I will investigate LinkedIn. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Kristen. I appreciate that. Okay, Clarice, you are not on Twitter. That's okay. I will make sure that we can connect on LinkedIn when I get there. That's perfect. That's perfect. Thank you. Also, enjoy the rest of the weekend. So much cool stuff coming up. Alors, merci à vous, bien sûr. And I look forward, hopefully, to meeting you all professionally at some point in the future. Thank you all so much.